The streets buzzed with life as cars zipped by and pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, each absorbed in their own world. It was a bright afternoon, and downtown seemed like a scene from a postcard. But for one woman, the day was about to take an unexpected, unjust turn. In a crisp business suit, her badge tucked away in her purse, she stepped out of her car after pulling into a small lot. The woman had an air of quiet authority, the kind that comes from years of experience. But today, she wasn't on duty. She had just finished a long shift at the station and planned to meet a friend for coffee. Little did she know, the next few minutes would unfold into a moment that neither she nor the man about to confront her would ever forget. A police cruiser pulled up behind her car, and a young officer climbed out, adjusting his sunglasses as he approached her with a mix of confidence and suspicion. He looked her up and down, as if sizing her up, before barking, "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" Startled, she turned to face him, her calm demeanor hiding the slight irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "Just parking," she said, her voice even. "Is there a problem?" The officer's expression hardened. "ID." Now, he demanded, his hand resting on his belt in a way that made his authority impossible to ignore. The woman frowned. "Excuse me? Why am I being stopped?" "You match the description of someone we're looking for," the officer replied curtly. His tone carried an edge that made it clear this wasn't just a routine check. It wasn't the first time she had encountered an officer with a chip on his shoulder, and sadly, it likely wouldn't be the last. "Description of what, exactly?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. "Just show me some identification," the officer snapped, his hand now drifting closer to his radio as if to signal backup. For a moment, she considered simply complying and ending the interaction quickly. But something about the officer's demeanor made her hesitate. She could feel the eyes of passers-by on her, their curiosity palpable as they slowed their steps to watch the exchange. "I'll need you to explain why I'm being detained," she said, holding her ground. The officer's face tightened. "You're refusing to cooperate? That's not a good idea." He moved closer, his posture rigid, his tone laced with a warning. This wasn't the first time she'd faced something like this. As a black woman, she'd grown accustomed to navigating moments like these with caution and grace. But this situation felt different. This officer wasn't just making an error in judgment, he was letting his bias take the wheel. "Listen," she said carefully, "I'm asking for clarity. I have every right to understand why I'm being questioned." "Step over here," the officer interrupted, gesturing toward the side of her car. Now. Her patience wavered, but she stayed calm. She knew the power dynamics at play, knew how easily this situation could escalate. What the officer didn't know, however, was who he was talking to. As she reached for her purse, the tension in the air grew thicker. The officer's stance grew more defensive. "Hands where I can see them," he barked suddenly, his voice rising above the hum of the city around them. Her hand froze mid-motion. "Relax," she said calmly. "I'm just grabbing my badge." The officer's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Badge? What badge?" She met his glare head-on. "I'm captain at the Central Precinct," she said evenly, watching as his expression began to shift. For a moment, it was as if time stood still. The officer blinked, confusion and disbelief flashing across his face. His authority, his certainty, seemed to waver in an instant. But was it too late to undo the damage already done? And just like that, the onlookers began to murmur, the weight of what was happening sinking in. Would he own up to his mistake? Or would his pride push him further down a path he couldn't easily come back from? Stay tuned to find out how this powerful confrontation unfolds and what lessons both sides will walk away with. The officer's face froze, his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-sentence. His hand hovered near his belt, uncertainty now replacing the confidence he displayed moments ago. The woman didn't move. She kept her gaze steady, her calm expression giving nothing away. She could feel the shift in energy, both in the officer's stance and in the small crowd that had gathered nearby. It wasn't often that someone like her found herself on this side of the badge, but she knew exactly how to handle it. "I'm serious," she said, her tone firm but controlled. "My badge is in my purse. May I show you?" The officer cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Go ahead," he said, his voice softer now, though still tinged with the remnants of his earlier authority. She moved slowly, deliberately, making no sudden movements as she reached into her bag. She knew how important it was to stay calm, even though frustration and anger simmered beneath the surface. As she pulled out her badge and extended it toward him, she watched his face closely. His eyes widened as he read the name and title engraved on the shiny piece of metal in front of him. "Captain?" he muttered under his breath, his brows furrowing as if trying to process what he was seeing. "That's right," she replied. "Captain of the Central Precinct. And I'd like to know why you stopped me." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his posture less rigid now, but his pride kept him from fully backing down. We've been looking for someone in the area," he said, his words stumbling out in fragments. "A suspect. Matching your description." Her eyes narrowed. "My description?" she repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. "I'd love to hear what exactly about me matches your suspect." He hesitated, glancing at the onlookers, whose murmurs had grown louder. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but instead of admitting fault, he doubled down. "It's standard procedure," he said quickly. "Just doing my job." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Standard procedure," she echoed, her voice steady but sharp. "Tell me, officer, does this standard procedure involve stopping people without cause? Or is this just how you treat women who look like me?" The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. The officer's face flushed, but he didn't answer. She could tell he wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in front of an audience. But she wasn't about to let him off the hook. "You see," she continued, her voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the murmurs of the crowd, "I know the rules. I've enforced them for years. And I also know when they're being bent or broken." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. She took a step closer, her badge still visible in her hand. "What's your name?" she asked, her tone as professional as it was commanding. "Officer Daniels," he mumbled, his earlier bravado now completely gone. "Well, Officer Daniels," she said, "I suggest you think carefully about how you handle situations like this in the future. You may not realize it, but every decision you make in that uniform reflects on all of us who wear it. And right now, you're not doing any of us proud." The crowd grew quieter, sensing the gravity of her words. Daniels looked down, his jaw tight, as though he was wrestling with a mix of embarrassment and resentment. She could see the conflict in his eyes, pride battling with the realization that he'd made a mistake. "You don't know what it's like out here," he muttered, almost too quietly for her to hear. Her expression softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "Actually, I do," she said. "I know exactly what it's like. I've been in this line of work for over 15 years. I've faced everything you can imagine and then some. And I know how hard it can be. But that doesn't excuse what just happened here." Daniels didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground. For a moment, the two stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. The crowd began to disperse slowly, sensing that the confrontation was nearing its end, or so they thought. But for her, this wasn't over. She wasn't about to let this moment pass without addressing the deeper issues at play. The question swirled in her mind. Why had Daniels singled her out? Was it a simple mistake, or was there something more insidious at work? And most importantly, how could she turn this into a teachable moment not just for Daniels, but for everyone watching? As she stood there, staring at the young officer who now seemed so unsure of himself, she knew this encounter was about more than just the two of them. It was about the broader system, the biases that permeated it, and the change that still needed to happen. But how far was she willing to push? And how would Daniels respond if she did? The questions lingered, unresolved, as the scene remained frozen in a delicate balance between conflict and understanding. The air between them was thick, almost suffocating. Officer Daniels fidgeted, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like a heavy burden. The woman watched him closely, her calm demeanor masking the storm brewing within her. She wasn't angry just for herself, she was angry for every person who had been stopped unfairly, treated as if they didn't belong, judged by nothing more than the color of their skin. A part of her wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to ignorance, and walk away. But she couldn't. Not this time. Not when the stakes were so high. She had spent her entire career fighting to prove herself in a system that wasn't always welcoming. To let this moment slide would be to betray not just herself, but the values she had sworn to uphold. Daniels finally looked up, his eyes darting nervously to hers and then back to the ground. "I didn't mean," he started, but she cut him off. "You didn't mean what?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Didn't mean to stop me without cause? Didn't mean to make assumptions based on how I look? Or didn't mean to get caught?" The words hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The woman stepped closer, her badge still glinting in the sunlight. She lowered her voice, just loud enough for him to hear. "Let me tell you something, Daniels," she said. "Every time you put on that uniform, you have a choice. You can be the kind of officer who protects and serves with integrity, or you can be the kind who lets fear and prejudice cloud your judgment. Which one are you going to be?" The question lingered, heavy and unanswerable. Daniels shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his discomfort palpable. Around them, a few stragglers from the crowd lingered, pretending not to watch but clearly hanging on to every word. The woman took a step back, giving him space to respond. But Daniels didn't speak. Instead, he reached for his radio, his movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him, unsure of what he was doing. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with suspicion. I need to call this in," he stammered. "Protocol." "Protocol?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "And what exactly are you planning to report? That you stopped a fellow officer without cause? That you let your biases lead you into a situation you can't handle?" Daniels froze, his hand hovering over his radio. His face was flushed, his confidence shattered. He looked around, as if searching for a way out, but there was none. He was trapped, and he knew it. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice softer now but still firm. "Listen to me. This isn't about making an example of you. It's about holding you accountable. Do you understand the difference?" He nodded hesitantly, his eyes fixed on the ground. For a moment, the tension seemed to ease, but then a voice crackled over the radio clip to his shoulder. "Daniels, status update." "Do you need assistance?" the voice asked. Daniels hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the radio. The woman watched him closely, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. Whatever he said next would determine how this encounter ended, and whether or not justice would be served. He pressed the button on his radio, his voice shaky as he responded. "Negative," he said. "Everything's under control." The woman exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. But she wasn't done yet. There was still one more thing she needed to do. "Daniels," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "Look me in the eye and tell me you understand what went wrong here. Tell me you'll do better." He looked up at her, his expression a mix of shame and determination. I understand," he said quietly. "And I will do better." The words hung in the air, fragile but genuine. For the first time, the woman saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. but she wasn't ready to let her guard down just yet. She knew that words were easy, but actions were what truly mattered. As she stood there, staring at the young officer who had so much to learn, she felt a sense of resolve. This moment wasn't just about her, or even about him. It was about the countless others who had faced similar injustices, about the system that allowed those injustices to persist, and about the possibility of change. But change wouldn't come easily. It never did. And as much as she wanted to believe Daniel's words, she knew that trust had to be earned. Would he follow through on his promise? Or would he fall back into old patterns, like so many others before him? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, as the tension between them reached its peak. The crowd had dispersed, the city buzzing around them as if nothing had happened. But for the woman and the officer, everything had changed. And the next move was hers. Just as the air between them began to shift, a faint but distinct sound broke through the tension. A second police cruiser pulling up to the scene. The woman's eyes flicked toward the approaching car, her instincts kicking in. She'd seen this play out before, and it rarely ended well. The tires crunched against the asphalt as the vehicle came to a stop, and a second officer stepped out. This one was older, with a worn face that carried the weight of decades in the field. His uniform was sharp, his movements precise, and his presence exuded authority. He took one look at the scene, Daniel standing stiffly, his radio still in hand, and the woman holding her badge, and his brow furrowed. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. Daniel stammered, visibly flustered. Captain Reynolds, I had a situation here." Thought she matched the description of Reynolds, held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. His sharp eyes scanned the woman, taking in her calm demeanor, her badge still held in plain view, and the subtle tension in her stance. Then, without saying a word to Daniels, he stepped toward her. "Captain," he said, addressing her directly, "I'm sorry to meet under these circumstances. I'm Reynolds, West Precinct. Are you all right?" The woman nodded, though her body remained tense. "I'm fine," she replied. "But your officer here seems to have trouble distinguishing between a suspect and a fellow member of the force." Reynolds turned back to Daniels, his expression hardening. "Is that right?" he asked, his voice low and pointed. Daniels opened his mouth to explain, but before he could get a word out, the woman stepped forward, her voice cutting through the moment like a blade. "There's more to it than that," she said, her tone firm. "This wasn't just a mistake. It's about judgment. It's about perception. And it's about accountability." Reynolds nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between her and Daniels. "I see," he said finally. "And what would you like to see happen next?" Before she could answer, the radio on Reynolds' shoulder crackled to life. "Reynolds, we've got an update on that suspect in the area. Surveillance confirms they're heading north on 5th. Repeat, suspect is moving north." The tension in the air grew thicker. Reynolds raised an eyebrow at Daniels. "Suspect, huh?" he said, his tone heavy with unspoken criticism. Daniels looked like he wanted to disappear. "I thought," he began, but Reynolds cut him off. "You thought wrong," Reynolds snapped. "And now we're wasting valuable time because you couldn't think clearly." The woman crossed her arms, her frustration mounting. "This is exactly the problem," she said, her voice sharp. "When officers act on instinct without thinking, it doesn't just harm the people they stop, it harms the entire system. And if you don't address this head on, it's going to keep happening." Reynolds nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. "You're absolutely right," he said. "But there's more going on here than you realize." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she asked. Reynolds hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "That suspect we're chasing," he said finally. "They've been targeting officers, setting traps, staging scenarios, trying to create chaos. Daniels here may have acted out of line, but this situation might not be as simple as it seems. The woman felt her chest tighten. A second plot, one she hadn't anticipated, was unfolding right in front of her. She glanced at Daniels, whose face was now pale, and then back at Reynolds. "Are you saying I was targeted?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Reynolds nodded grimly. "It's possible," he said. "Someone might have tipped off Daniels with a fake lead to get him here, knowing it would create a scene. We've been seeing more of this lately, people trying to exploit tensions between law enforcement and the community." The woman's mind raced. If this was true, it changed everything. What had seemed like a straightforward case of bias and poor judgment might actually be part of something far more calculated. And if that was the case, walking away now wasn't an option. "What's your next move?" Reynolds asked, his tone even but probing. She squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "First," she said, "I'll handle Daniels. Then, we find out who's really pulling the strings here." The older officer gave her a small nod, respect flickering in his eyes. But Daniels, standing frozen a few feet away, looked like he was still struggling to process everything. She turned to him, her voice firm but not unkind. "Daniels," she said, "you need to decide right now. Are you part of the problem, or part of the solution?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze flickering between her and Reynolds. The weight of the moment bore down on him, the full consequences of his actions or inactions coming into sharp focus. The city buzzed around them, unaware of the drama unfolding in this quiet parking lot. But for the three officers standing there, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But would they be ready for what they found? Reynolds' radio crackled again, this time with an urgency that cut through the tension. "Suspect spotted entering the abandoned warehouse on 5th. Backup requested immediately." The woman's eyes met Reynolds, and in that instant, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever personal grievances or lessons could be addressed later, right now, the situation demanded action. Without waiting for further instruction, she straightened her posture and nodded toward her own car. "I'll follow you. Let's end this." Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Let's move." He turned to Daniels, who looked torn between relief and dread. "Stay on comms and coordinate backup. Don't leave this spot until I say otherwise." Daniels nodded, his voice barely audible as he replied, "Yes, sir." Within moments, the woman was in her car, her adrenaline pumping as she trailed Reynolds' cruiser toward the warehouse. Her mind raced. The idea that this whole encounter could have been orchestrated sent a chill down her spine. Was someone out there deliberately trying to sow chaos between officers and the community? And if so, why? When they arrived, the warehouse loomed in front of them, its broken windows and faded exterior casting eerie shadows under the fading sunlight. Reynolds stepped out of his cruiser, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, and the woman followed, her own instincts sharpening. They approached cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner, every movement. "Central to all units," Reynolds said into his radio. "We're entering the building. Keep the perimeter secure." The woman glanced at him. "What do we know about this suspect?" "Enough to be cautious," he replied. "They're smart. Tactical. And they know how to manipulate a situation." They moved in tandem, their steps deliberate as they entered the dimly lit space. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and rust, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. As they moved deeper, the woman spotted signs of recent activity: discarded wrappers, footprints in the dust. Whoever had been here wasn't far. A faint noise to their left made both of them freeze. Reynolds motioned for her to circle around while he approached from the opposite side. She gripped her flashlight tightly, her other hand hovering near her weapon, and moved silently toward the sound. When she rounded the corner, her beam illuminated a figure crouched in the shadows. The suspect, a wiry man in dark clothing, froze like a deer caught in headlights. His hands hovered near a bag on the ground, a bag filled with what looked like electronics and police scanners. Don't move! She commanded, her voice firm and unyielding. Reynolds appeared on the other side, his weapon drawn but steady. Hands where we can see them, he ordered. The suspect hesitated for a split second, then raised his hands, a smirk creeping onto his face. You're faster than I thought, he said, his tone dripping with mock admiration. I almost got you, though. The woman's heart raced, but she kept her composure. Almost isn't good enough. Now step away from the bag. The man obeyed, but his smirk didn't falter. You think this is over? You have no idea what's coming. Reynolds cuffed him, his movements swift and efficient. We'll see about that, he muttered. As they secured the scene and waited for backup to arrive, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The man's confidence, his calm demeanor, it didn't fit. She knelt by the bag, carefully inspecting its contents. Amid the gadgets and scanners, she found something that made her blood run cold: a list of names. Officers' names. Hers was at the top. She held up the paper, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Reynolds, look at this. He took the list, his jaw tightening as he read it. This isn't random, he said quietly. They're targeting us. Individually. The suspect chuckled from where he sat, his smirk widening. Told you. You're just pieces on a board, and we're playing the game. Reynolds' face darkened, but the woman didn't waver. She leaned closer to the suspect, her voice low and cutting. Who's we? Who's behind this? The man's smile faltered for the first time, but he quickly recovered. You'll find out soon enough, he said cryptically. If you survive. The words hung in the air, heavier than the dust swirling around them. As the backup arrived and the suspect was taken away, the woman and Reynolds exchanged a glance. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The list, the manipulation, the calculated attempts to disrupt trust, it all pointed to something bigger. And while this battle was won, the war was just beginning. The suspect's mocking words stayed with her long after he was driven away in the squad car. Even with the cuffs on, he radiated a sense of control, as if everything had gone according to plan. She stood in the dim light of the warehouse, staring at the list of names in her hand. Each name represented someone who had dedicated their life to protecting others. And now they were targets. Her name being at the top sent a chill through her, but it also fueled her resolve. Reynolds approached, his expression grim but steady. This isn't just some random criminal operation, he said. It's coordinated, methodical. Whoever's behind this knows how to exploit weaknesses, stir the pot. She nodded, her mind already working through the implications. They want us to be afraid. To doubt each other. To second-guess every decision. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her pocket. But that's exactly why we can't let them win. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Daniels had been ordered to write a full report, and the weight of his earlier mistake was etched on his face. He sat at his desk, the pen in his hand hovering above the paper. She could tell he was struggling, not just with the report, but with himself. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. Daniels, she said softly, you messed up. But what matters now is what you do next. Learn from this. Be better. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and determination. I will, he said quietly. Satisfied, she stepped into Reynolds' office, where he was poring over the evidence they'd collected. The list of names was spread out on the desk, along with photographs of the suspect's equipment. He looked up as she entered, his face serious. This goes deeper than we thought, he said, motioning to the items in front of him. The scanners, the fake reports, they're all part of a larger network. We've already traced some of the equipment back to previous incidents involving other officers. She leaned over the desk, her mind racing. And the suspect? Did he give us anything? Reynolds shook his head. Not yet. but it's only a matter of time. They worked late into the night, piecing together the threads of the case. Every new detail pointed to a group that was intent on destabilizing law enforcement from the inside out. It wasn't just about targeting officers, it was about eroding trust between the police and the communities they served. By the time dawn broke, they had a clearer picture of the operation but knew there was still a long way to go. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You know," he said, "there are easier jobs out there." She chuckled softly, despite the weight of the situation. "But none as important." He nodded in agreement. "You're right about that." The resolution of the case didn't come quickly, but it came with persistence. Over the following weeks, their department worked tirelessly, uncovering the group's methods and bringing more members to justice. The list of names, which had been a symbol of fear, became a rallying cry for unity. Officers across the city banded together, determined to stand strong against the attempt to divide them. For her, the experience left a lasting mark. It wasn't just about the confrontation with Daniels or the chilling discovery in the warehouse. It was about the bigger picture, the importance of accountability, the power of resilience, and the need for constant vigilance in a world where trust could so easily be broken. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, she found herself walking into the precinct, her badge clipped securely to her belt. The usual hustle and bustle greeted her, but something was different. Daniels approached, his posture straighter, his eyes brighter. "Captain," he said, his voice steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for not giving up on me." She smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "You're welcome, Daniels. Just remember, every day is a chance to do better." As she moved through the precinct, the lessons of the past weeks stayed with her. The challenges she'd faced weren't unique, but the way she'd handled them had set a precedent. She knew there would always be new hurdles, new threats to face. But she also knew that as long as she stayed true to her values and held others to the same standard, change was possible. Stepping outside, she took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. The city stretched out before her, vibrant and alive, full of stories waiting to unfold. She wasn't naive, she knew the work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Reynolds. "Suspect in custody gave us a lead. Might want to hear this." She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. Another chapter was beginning, and she was ready. Because in the end, being a cop wasn't just a job. It was a calling. And she wasn't done answering it.